honor to have Matthew Bishop here before. As you know, he is the author of a book that, as far as I know, created a new way of referring to the philanthropic sector in the world, Philanthrocapitalism. And it's now 10 years since he wrote it. He and his partner, Michael Green, wrote it together down here at the Sanford School while they were relaxing and enjoying the sunshine and occasional rain. But it was before that. Matthew was the philanthropic columnist for The Economist for a number of years, and earned the respect of a lot of people in philanthropy, major donors, foundation heads, everything else, because he wrote extremely well and continues to be interested in writing. But he decided, I think, to try, having written Philanthrocapitalism and having worked on worked with a lot of foundation people and philanthropists, he decided that he would like to try the inside side of things. So he was recruited to run to the Rockefeller Foundation, where he has been, I think, for about a year now, and is responsible for a number of things. The most, I guess, celebrated part is he oversees the Bellagio Conference Center in Italy, which the Rockefeller Foundation has been running for how many years?
60 years.
60 years. And for those of you who aspire to go to a place where you can think and write about philanthropy, there's no better place in the world, I'm told. I've not been there. I said at lunch, I don't really want to go, actually. But in any event, that's because I just don't do things like that. I'd rather stay home in my study and write. But in any event, that is Matthew's. It's not his only responsibility, but it's one of his major responsibilities at the Rockefeller Foundation. And so I assume we'll see lots of changes occurring at Bellagio under his administration. So Matthew, thank you so much for joining us again. 10 years after the publication of Philanthrocapitalism, why don't you reflect a little bit for us on what things have happened that you think are interesting, anything you want to say. I encouraged Matthew at lunch today saying, given what's been written about the philanthropy sector and philanthropists and foundations in the 10 years, it's really time for him to do a sequel to Philanthrocapitalism and deal with many of the changes that occurred. So Matthew, welcome to Duke again.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I think we have a presentation that's going to come up, which is a very, just a series of pictures.
There are more
really,
chairs
so
over here.
Not too taxing on the eyes, but thank you for having me back. It was great. We're saying 10 years after Philanthrocapitalism. It's actually 10 years and 50 weeks because the 11th anniversary will come up very soon, and I happen to know that because we published the book 4 days after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which in the world of publishing books about philanthropy, if you wanted to time a book worse, I think I would take on all comers on that challenge. I think literally people were incapable of thinking about philanthropy, even if they had a lot of money, because in their minds they didn't have that money anymore, and they wondered where the world was going. So it was about the worst possible moment, but I'll come on to talk a bit more about that. In one of the, and I should say before we start, Joel very kindly mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bellagio Center. I wanted to say two things. One, that in this talk I'm giving my views entirely in a personal capacity, reflecting on my experience since writing the book, and certainly not in any sense reflecting the opinions of the Rockefeller Foundation. Secondly, the Bellagio Center, for those of you that don't know anything about it, is a beautiful place on Lake Como in Italy, but was given to the Rockefellers by a princess, Italian princess, who turns out to have been the heiress to the Canadian Club whiskey family, who was one of a number of Americans and Canadians that in that period I think were quite sought after trophies of down on their luck aristocracy in Britain and Europe. And she ended up being married to a count, to becoming a princess, and had this villa. She gave the villa to the Rockefeller Foundation to really be a center for the study of international peace and human understanding. And we have a residency there, so people who are writing books can apply to write a book and spend a month there, really in a small group. The only obligation is to eat with your other residents and to present once to the residency during that time. People naturally, I think, who are writing very interesting books.
And they have a
tend to
staff
go
of
there.
chefs there too.
Good chefs, but all sorts of people have been there, from sort of Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Marion Wright Edelman and beyond, Maya Angelou, all sorts of characters over the years. We also have 2 very small conference centres that take 20 or so people at a time, and the mission of the events in those conferences, which is about 50 or 60 events a year, is to bring people together around trying to solve a particular challenge that's out there at the moment. So I would say to someone who has is doing really interesting work in social change, if you ever sit down and think, if I could get the following 20 people in the room for a week, we could really come up with some ideas that would move the needle on this work. I say, well, please apply to us and we'll see if we can get you in. Half the events a year are outside organizations that host those events with us. And over the years, things like the Global Alliance on Vaccines was that whole alliance was formed there. The funders were found, everything. The concept of impact investing came out of a conference that happened there. Further back, I think the field of, as we know it, of modern international relations was really conjured up in the context of the Cold War, and more recently fields like planetary health were sort of conjured up there as well. So it has a tremendous history, and we're trying to build on that going forward. So if any of you do have ideas, please get in touch. So as I was saying, where do I point this thing? Oh, here we go. So Philanthrocapitalism, in the summer of 2007, written here at Duke, came out the week after Lehman Brothers with the title, How the Rich Can Save the World. Good reviews in the circumstances, but Phil Buchanan, who has written a book that's getting a lot of circulation at the moment, wrote this absolutely brutal review in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which he headlined Lehman Brothers to the Rescue. It's the way that he sort of summed up our analysis of the world of philanthropy. My co-author and I, sat down after that moment and said, well, normally when you write a book, publish a book, you get a few months grace period to go out and sell your book to the world. Should we give up at this point and just leave town and never be heard of again? Or we actually sat down and thought, actually, in the context of the global crash that was going on at the time, there were all these articles being written about how the age of business is over, the age of the non-profit sector is over, it's all going to be big government coming back because only government is capable of picking up the mess and solving it. And we said, well, no, it's true, there's going to be a lot of demand on government, but that's going to be largely about bailing out all the existing failed institutions. There's going to be even less money around for the sort of thing that we were talking about in Philanthrocapitalism, which was this new money that was coming in to the world of social change from the new entrepreneurial class that had emerged, that had made unprecedented fortunes, and that how they use that money is going to be more significant rather than less significant in the post-crash period. And so we said, actually, we're going to stick to our guns, and we're going to carry on talking about this, and we're going to go and find anyone that will listen to this message and really try and share with them and help them figure out how to do a better job of using that money. Because I think one of the things we did notice in the book was there were lots of people with brilliant ideas or brilliant aspirations, but actually brilliant execution of philanthropy is very, very difficult. One thing we did do is change the title of the book a little bit. We dumped the rich at that point and replaced it with How Giving Can Save the World, and we got rid of the dollar sign, and we put a rock star and famous TV host, and Bill and Warren on the front of it, in the hope that that would boost sales. And we got Bill Clinton he offered to write a foreword to it, which we accepted against Joel's advice, who said, "Stay away from that man." But anyway, we took his foreword, and that was we relaunched the book about a year later. So this is 10 years since the relaunch of Philanthrocapitalism. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are the starting point of the book, for those of you that haven't read it. And we start with a moment at the New York Public Library in 2006, where I was lucky enough to be a reporter in the room, where Buffett gets up on stage with Bill and Melinda and says, "I'm going to give away most of my money to tackle problems of extreme poverty in the world." And we had this situation of these three people up on stage, probably the two most successful business people in history at that point, certainly in modern history, and unprecedented in terms of getting up at this point of their lives and saying, "We're going to give away most of our money to help the poorest people on the planet, the most vulnerable people on the planet, get out of their misery and get into a better trajectory." And so, sitting in the audience, my view was, well, is this possible? Is this just an extraordinary one-off event? Are they mad? Are they serious? How would they do this? What's brought them to this point? And with Michael Green, who was someone I was at high school with, and then had reconnected at various points over the years, he was working for the Department for International Development in the United Kingdom, really dealing on the front end of the Make Poverty History campaign, which was a big campaign around trying to get a lot of aid and trade work moving forward. And we just spent a lot of time debating this and said, let's write a book about it. And that's where the book begins. And what we found was that this wasn't a one-off. It was clearly a movement, that lots of people who were making a lot of money in America initially, but also increasingly around the world, were turning to philanthropy. And they were taking on some very big, difficult challenges. And as Warren Buffett said, when he gave that money to Bill Gates, his foundation, making money is the easy part, giving it away is very much harder. We're trying to take on problems that many great people over the years have taken on and not succeeded in as much as we hope to succeed. And we recognize that we're standing on the shoulders of giants and trying to tackle really, really deep-rooted problems. And so lots of other people we reported on in the book who also were going about philanthropy in that way. And I think the book did have an immediate set of criticisms thrown against it for just the fact that we stood up and celebrated this new wave of philanthropy, even though we at the same time raised a number of questions about what it would have to do to succeed. So Michael Edwards, who was a long-time Ford Foundation leader, he wrote a book before we came out, before he'd even seen our book actually, which was an interesting strategy, attacking our book because we were apparently against grassroots-based philanthropy, and he didn't really like the idea of scale. So he was the main opponent at the time, and that all kind of fizzled out because of the crash, and no one really cared about grassroots people in that moment because they were worried about the world falling apart. I think now that has come much more back into vogue as one of the criticisms that we're hearing a lot as the book is being attacked for a second time round now. Most prominently, of course, by Anand Giridharadas, with his book, which accuses philanthrocapitalists of being practitioners of an elite charade. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later. My summary is that I was very disappointed on reading the book. I felt he didn't really report on philanthropy at all. It was a very narrow book, very much picking on some obvious charlatans and highlighting them, but without really looking at other examples which would have maybe told a different story, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which you would think anyone writing about philanthropy today would feel some obligation to write about it, although it's interesting that Bill did endorse the book, perhaps because he wasn't written about in the book. I don't know. Anyway, interesting speculation on that one. But also George Soros is attacked for not being interested in systems change. I would again say if you properly reported on George Soros, it would be very hard, whatever you think of him, good or bad, to think that he wasn't interested in systems change. So I have a lot of problems with the book, but it clearly has touched a nerve, I think, because it has picked up on two things that we actually anticipated in the book. One, the rise in inequality, and that at some point, if you don't have a response, if the people who are doing well out of inequality aren't responding to the many people who aren't doing well in that environment, then you're going to have a social crisis of some kind, and clearly we've had that, and we're in the middle of it. And I think secondly, just a general anger towards the rich and business, which is continuing, I think, to grow. So he did, and I think the book has done very well because he captured that anger. Now, I would say that many of the philanthropists that we wrote about in Philanthrocapitalism, have been concerned about the rise in inequality and have been trying to do something about it. And it's very hard to make a very clear connection, as he alleges, that all their philanthropy is acting in their self-interest to try and preserve their business interests. I think in some cases you could probably make that argument more easily than in other cases, but generally I think the people I would be attacking is the people who aren't doing philanthropy, and those who are perhaps the most successful philanthropists of our time, who are those who are fueling the anti-government movement at the moment, and have seemed to have made a great success of it, not just here in the States, but around the world. And obviously David Koch died recently, but his brother Charles Koch, continues to preside over extraordinarily effective philanthropy in its own terms, but which is in the interest of its backers, but probably isn't in the interest of the society as a whole, I would argue. But anyway, so that book we can come back and talk about. We've had two other main critiques. One is the Phil Buchanan, who I mentioned earlier, who has written a book called Giving Done Right, which is actually a very positive book about philanthropy. I don't know why Phil disagrees with me feels he disagrees with me so much, because I feel we agree a lot on a lot of the basic points. One of the points we make in Philanthrocapitalism is that actually you need to build up organizations that are working on the ground so that they have the capacity to do the work they're setting to do. That one of the curses of the philanthropic world is you have to spend all your time raising money, you have to spend all your time raising money for particular projects, no one funds overheads, no one funds the back office and all that kind of thing, which is all the sort of thing that Phil has been talking about in his book, and I completely agree with him on. What he doesn't like is the notion that anyone would view philanthropy as an investment. And one of the things we talk a lot about in Philanthrocapitalism is that one of the things that many of these new philanthropists are bringing to the philanthrocapitalists are bringing to the table is that they like to think about their philanthropy in a similar way that they think about their businesses. So they ask questions about what are we trying to achieve, how do we think the money is being invested effectively, what sort of outcomes are we hoping for, what return on our money are we getting. And I think it's easy to confuse that with saying we want to turn charities into businesses, which I think some of them do, but most of them don't want to do. But I think an investment mindset which says I'm going to view my donations as rigorously as I view my financial investments, I'm going to really ask, what's this money going to be used for? How's it going to be deployed? What am I expecting back from it? That just seems to me the definition of being responsible with your money. And investment language helps you think about that. Now, obviously, some investors do crazy things with their money, and so I'm not encouraging philanthropists to do that, although some of the people like Soros, who have taken the biggest risk as investors also have taken very, very big risks as philanthropists and have been successful. I mean, I don't think any philanthropic advisor would have said to George Soros, yes, put a lot of money into the former Soviet Union and Soviet-controlled parts of Europe in the hope that you're going to bring down communism and produce liberal societies.
But he did.
Some of those, but he did it, and it actually probably, you probably say he made more of a contribution than many other people, diplomats, politicians, and the like, in bringing that down. So, I actually still think that an investment framework is a good way to think about most of your long-term serious philanthropy. I think there's also should be a place for just discretionary, emotional response philanthropy, but the investment framework is a good way to think about it. And then we have this book by Robrish from Sanford University, and he makes the point, really, which is that most philanthropy reflects a different set of priorities to those that the government has. And he has a problem with that because he says, the philanthropy is being tax privileged in some way, and therefore you would expect that the tax privilege ought to go into activities that reflect the priorities of the government or maybe the people more broadly defined. And I think he has a point, up to a point. There's certainly, I think any philanthropy you have to be able to, if it's getting a tax break, it ought to be able to answer the question, are you making better use of this money than the government would do in terms of driving social good? That ought to be an exercise that has gone through. On the other hand, I think that we are dealing with a number of, there is a reasonable critique of some government, which is that it doesn't innovate very well. And a lot of what I'm seeing from philanthrocapitalists is about investing in experiments and pilots that test new ideas, and if those ideas succeed, they often get embraced and scaled up by government, and so they become a sort of R&D, an experimental lab for government in some ways, because government is the most likely and most capable entity of taking small ideas and scaling them up so they have a massive impact. So I think of those books, Rob's is, it's kind of interesting, but I think he's a bit utopian about what government can do at its best, and hasn't really answered the question for me of how do you drive innovation in government, given, particularly in democracies as we're finding at the moment, the constant election cycle really does work quite hard against people who want to take risks, because anything you do that doesn't work out, you immediately are going to get a front page story criticizing you for doing it. So I think it encourages a lot of risk aversion and makes that quite a difficult act to do innovation. I mean, the classic example I would take is Michael Bloomberg when he went to be the mayor of New York. He wanted to start basically a very, very intense management training center for school principals, for public schools. And he realized very quickly that given it was going to cost about $150,000 per head teacher per principal to be taught, to be trained, that he would never get this through the budget in New York City, because the New York Post and New York Post and News would be all over this and shut it down. So he, with a number of philanthropists like Eli Broad, funded this principal training center, and then after a few years, it was so clear that the schools that were being managed by these principals were doing so much better that it was a no-brainer for the city to take over the funding of that entity. So that's sort of classic, I think, good case study of philanthrocapitalism working. Anyway, so January of 2009, I get invited to Davos to sort of chair a discussion on philanthrocapitalism and philanthrocrisis, with people like Clinton and Gates and Muhammad Yunus and Richard Branson. And at that point, and this is where I would have some sympathy with Anand and his book, is I asked the question at the time, do you think this is a crisis of capitalism? Do you think we need to see a fundamentally different view, a different set of behaviors from the leaders of philanthropy? Should, in this moment, should the rich be stepping up, and should companies be stepping up to the next level in terms of their giving back to society? And I was really kind of disappointed by the answers I got. Only Muhammad Yunus actually said, I think there are serious flaws in the model of capitalism, and we need to really focus on fixing those flaws. Branson said, I think capitalism is still the best system, that we'll come through this. And Bill Gates, and I think this is where he would be very different to, say, Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, written in the late 19th century, he is very clear that unless the successful people in society give away most of their wealth, and indeed, the man who dies rich dies disgraced by his wealth, is basically what he said. The basically socialism or communism would bring down the system, and anarchy would follow. Gates won't go there for whatever reason, and what he was saying back in 2009 was, for me, giving has been very fulfilling. It's been the most fulfilling thing in my life. I would urge other wealthy people to give, because there's nothing better than helping to save millions of people's lives, which you can do as a very wealthy person. So it was a very positive message. He wouldn't get into any of the social structural dimensions. Whereas David Rockefeller Sr., who I had interviewed shortly before that, who was in his late 80s, I think, at the time, he was very, very obsessed with the rise in inequality and how philanthropy needed to fill and respond to that. And I think if we look at what's happened since, you'll find some of the philanthrocapitalists that really are concerned about inequality. Many still, I think, have blinkers around that. They're addressing particular problems, I think, sincerely, but they don't feel that the system itself, or they hadn't done until quite recently, was under serious challenge. And I think as a result, they missed a lot of opportunities and to really give more, I think, and to give more effectively around trying to reform the system earlier in the process than now, which is now it's getting a lot of attention. You're seeing lots of philanthropic gatherings around reimagining capitalism and reimagining society, which I think should have been happening 7 or 8 years ago, or at least. So anyway, but Yunus, I think, did get this. He understood that this importance of business rediscovering its social purpose, and that philanthropy needed to be glue in society rather than sort of a more focused or narrow sort of personal activity. It should be seen as something that's much more part of a movement that's about ensuring that society continues to flourish and prosper. So how are we doing on time here? So philanthropy was what got me going. When I was at The Economist, I wrote an original article when Buffett, and maybe I should have called the book Philanthropy, and it would have sold a lot better. So another piece of advice when writing books is words that no one can say, not good on the title. And Philanthrocapitalism turns out to be for some reason people get their tongues twisted about it. Philanthropy would have been good. Anyway, moving on. So I asked Bill, I interviewed him on stage a couple of years afterwards, and I said, what do you think of the book? And he had two answers. One I thoroughly agreed with. The other one I thought was very odd given his subsequent behavior. The answer that I thought was correct was, Melinda, you didn't really write about the role of Melinda in the book. You wrote about me and didn't take her into account. And generally, he critiqued the book for not giving enough space to the role of women in philanthropy. And I think if I was writing the book today, I would absolutely recognize that was a terrible a mission, and wasn't done. It's a bit like the Forbes list of innovators that came out this week, which 99 of them, the best 100 innovators in America, according to Forbes, are men, which I think reflects the uselessness of their algorithm rather than what they really think. And I think with the philanthropy thing, so many of the philanthropists, the money was made by ostensibly by the man in the partnership, and so you tend to write about them as the philanthropist, whereas in fact most of the actually serious thinking about the philanthropy turns out to have been done by the other half of the partnership, who also probably made a big contribution to the making the money as well. So, which is also not very well reported. So, he is, and I think Melinda's role in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think it will turn out to have been huge in all sorts of ways. Whenever somebody gets around to writing a proper accounting of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that will be one of the stories that comes through. And I think without any doubt, that foundation has completely changed the way the world will think about philanthropy forever, or ought to think about philanthropy, whatever. No one could say it was a faultless organization. It has many weird and sprawling bureaucratic elements. Trying to get money out of them, you enter a sort of maze, I think, and it can often be, you often wonder whether Bill and Melinda really know what's going on in the foundation, but nonetheless, it has saved millions of lives, I think, without doubt, and he through his personal example, she through her personal example, have really set a very high benchmark for what is expected of people in their own peer group as they succeed. Now, it's interesting that, maybe if you take the Anand view, you just don't want the rich to do anything. You want them just to be taxed very, very heavily. But if you do take the view that you want the rich to actually give back significantly, they have really set the benchmark.
And for those who don't know, Melinda Gates is a Duke alumna.
Well, there we are.
And was a trustee of Duke for a while.
Excellent. So the other thing was that he said, Bill Gates said, the book, you write about these philanthrocapitalists as if there's a movement going on. And I said, well, I think there is a movement going on. And then he launched the Giving Pledge about 6 months later, which, if it's not a movement, I don't know how you define a movement. But it's like a movement amongst the billionaires of the world to say, let's sign a letter promising to give away by the end of your life at least half of your wealth. And now I think it's 114 at that point. There may be more.
It's
I think probably
200.
more now. Nearly 200 now. Now, I recently heard from people who were involved in the launch of the Giving Pledge that at the time when they were going to launch it originally, they were going to have 3 requirements. The letter that you give away half by the end of your life, a requirement that you actually start doing so immediately, so an active giving, it's a material increase in how much you give, and a requirement about how effective the giving was. But I think one or more of the principals ruled that you were only going to get people to sign one thing in a pledge, and you've got to pick one of those 3. And the one that they chose was the amount, half of your wealth during your life, by the end of your life. And so, but I think that it does reflect a problem with the Giving Pledge that I think some people would say is quite a serious one, which is a lot of people are signing the letters, but a lot fewer of them are really making the kind of big step up in giving that you would hope to see. And so many of them do seem to be leaving it until the end of their lives, which is great as far as it goes, but I think a big missed opportunity. I think Carnegie, again, would say, you actually can bring tremendous skills to bear in deploying your money now while you're alive, rather than leaving it to an organization to deal with it afterwards. And so others have done. I mean, some really have increased their giving dramatically as a result of the pledge. But I think I would still say that we've not seen enough of that money really moving. And I saw a chart about a year ago that someone had tracked how much the giving had gone up for each of the first 100 signatories of the Giving Pledge, and how much their wealth had gone up since they signed the Giving Pledge. And it turns out their wealth has gone up about 400%, and their giving has gone up about 30 to 40%. So that kind of, and I guess these have been particularly good times to be rich in the last few years because of the way the markets have gone and so forth. But nonetheless, you would hope that the Giving Pledge would have produced a much more significant outflow of funds than.
I'm not going to get the figures right. But Tom Tierney, who was the co-author with me on Give Smart, has been doing work on just that question, and it turns out that that if you look at the wealth of, let's say, the top 200 or 300 people in the United States, the percentage they're giving away is something like 1.2%. I mean, that's not the exact figures, but it is. What it does say is that the massive undergiving for people of that wealth, given the problems in society.
Yep. So I just wanted to talk very briefly, because I think one of the messages that people may have taken away from the Anand book and some of the other critiques of philanthropy is that nothing gets achieved. And I would just take the Gavi Vaccine Alliance that Bill Gates was very early involved in, which at the time it was launched in 2000. Basically 5 million children a year were dying under the age of 5 because they hadn't got basic vaccines. And over the last 19 years, that number has been reduced by about, I think somewhere around 60 to 70%, because of vaccines getting out to people, maybe even 80%. And so they, the people have tried to do economic calculations of what $1 given to Gavi is worth in terms of the long-term economic benefits to society, and it's somewhere between 15 and 80 times the value of the dollar that goes in, if you take those economic analyses to be valid.
It's also interesting, the first major step in dealing with AIDS was financed by the Diamond Foundation. They're the ones who put up the money back in 1982, right when the AIDS epidemic was first beginning to be recognized. They put up the money for scientific work at the New York City AIDS Research Center, which produced the first cocktail treatment for AIDS that had ever been invented. So you see, there's a direct line between the philanthropy that created that first step and what Gavi has done ever since, and the hundreds of millions of dollars that have flowed in. They still haven't found a vaccine, but they seem to be moving closer.
Yeah, this is interesting. Gavi was followed by the Global Fund, which did the AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Again, huge success, as you say. Both of those funds are now seeking new finance at a time when progress is starting to stall a bit in a number of those areas, for various reasons, ranging from, maybe getting to the harder cases to, certainly in Pakistan, I think there was, because of the way spies were trying to track down bin Laden, they were posing as vaccine people, and so people obviously reacted against anyone offering vaccines. So there's different reasons that things have stalled, but massive success. It shows, Bill Gates' basic point was he was reading the World Development Report when back in the late 90s. There was an explanation that you could save millions of lives through investing in these vaccines of various kinds, I think TB to start with, and he has proved that's true, and I think a lot of other people have invested in that model. But there's still one child in, I think there's still, of the initial group of people, populations that weren't being vaccinated, they've got 80% of the way, so there's still 20% of the original target of people each year they need to vaccinate that still have to receive vaccination. So there's still some way to go. Let's take marriage equality. I think, obviously massive social movement, but when the history of that movement is properly written, it may have been written already, and I haven't read the book, but lots of philanthropy played a huge role in that, funding key court cases.
Tim Gill.
Yeah.
Really?
Big success. I mean, imagine half the world's view on this topic has literally been transformed in less than 20 years, probably less than 10 years in some ways. The role of philanthropy in that was absolutely crucial. This man, Nandan Nilekani, is someone I wrote about in the book. He co-founded a company called Infosys. He's the man behind something called the India Stack, or Aadhaar, which basically in India 10, 15 years ago, most people didn't have their birth registered, they didn't have any unique ID. He created a system which has now given 1.2 billion Indians a unique ID with biometrics in, and then on top of that has been built this whole series of bank accounts, systems to transfer welfare payments to people, bypassing very corrupt officials that used to take most of that money away. They're building all sorts of other services and building a whole digital platform for the country of India that is a very complicated alliance of businesses, philanthropies and government. And he managed to persuade the Congress party to do the initial setup of this, and then when Congress lost power to the BJP, the normal expectation in India would be the new government would shut this down. He went in, persuaded Modi that they should carry on with this experiment, and now, I think if you wanted that one example of how in a very, very brief period you could drive massive change, India now, I think India now is really in a position where it can use data in a way to drive social change and to get benefits to people who need it, to provide education, to provide healthcare services through a digital delivery that just is better than anywhere else in the world in terms of its own inherent platform. Now, it's not without its controversies, as here. People worry rightly about the data world that we're living in and how do we regulate it properly. And one of the challenges in a country that doesn't have a strong regulation, and India I think wouldn't have strong enough regulation, is that there's surveillance opportunities. The government may exploit some of those powers that the platform gives it. But I think again, it's a democracy. They're having those debates. They're sorting it out. And what you're going to have out of India is probably one of those much talked about but rarely observed cases of leapfrogging, where they will have a digital state platform that will be the best in the world. And it's thanks to them. And then another thing, if you look back over the 10-year period, we wrote about business and its social responsibility. This is a man called Hamdi Ulukaya. He founded Chobani, which many of you will have had their yogurt. He himself was a Kurd from Turkey who came to America with like $300 or $3,000 and somehow managed to start a company. And about half of his employees are refugees. And he started a foundation to bring businesses together to address the refugee crisis around the world. That kind of business model, was not really considered appropriate in America 10 years ago, where the Milton Friedman view was still dominant, that the social responsibility of business was to maximize profits. Now I think we've had the Business Roundtable come out in the last few weeks and say, we're now adopting a stakeholder framework, that we recognize we should be investing back in society and not just maximizing shareholder profits. Very interesting, and he is one of this new breed of leaders. You get Mark Benioff at Salesforce and around the world, all sorts of new business leaders who are starting to come out and say something and actually act, I think, in ways that are much more long-term in their orientation, and as the longer term you view your role in the world, then the more likely you are to do constructive things rather than just take money out. So I think that's been a huge shift in the last 10 years. We've had this emerging field of impact investing come out, which is still, I think a lot smaller than I would like to see it be, but it's this notion that investors actually, are deliberately using their investments to both make money and try and deliver a specific social or environmental outcome at the same time. Now we're having funds have been raised that are managing billions of dollars, going around seeking those kind of investment opportunities. And if you look at the capital markets as a whole, there is definitely a shift in the center of gravity in the markets happening, where the biggest fund managers like BlackRock are talking a very different sort of language to what they were talking about 10 years ago. Now, again, I would say there is a danger that this is a kind of reputation washing. I personally think there is enough sincerity that if the rest of us can put the right activism and peer pressure on these groups, they could really move significantly in that direction. But it's definitely the battle of philosophies is won for now by people who have a much more philanthropic, philanthrocapitalistic mindset, and we just need to make sure that really translates into action. It's also gone global. I mean, I put this is my all-time favorite business card that anyone ever gave me. This is a Chinese philanthropist who, just the list I'm not sure he's the best philanthropist actually in China. I think he's the most. Anyway.
It's a real business card?
It's a real business card. I blanked out his details, so I don't want you all calling him up. Yes, environmental preservation demolition expert is a particularly good one. But anyway, but actually, I'm flippant about a serious point. Is that we've seen, again, when philanthrocapitalism came out, there were very few notable examples of new entrepreneurs in the developing world embracing philanthropy. Now, there are very serious people. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, has, I think, stepped down today as chairman of his company to go full time into philanthropy, and is very much being advised by Bill Gates and other eminent philanthropists. What you've seen, I think, partly as the result of the Giving Pledge, is that as you go around the world, this very traditional American idea of being a successful business person means that you have to go and become a serious philanthropist. Is really taking off as a global idea. And again, I think there's an enormous opportunity in that if we can actually scrutinize properly and hold these new philanthropists to account, that they will actually start to do that giving in a very effective way. And it's going to be very interesting to watch Jack Ma and what he does, because he is very smart and he's very plugged into the best thinking around on these issues, but operating obviously in a very different environment where you have a Chinese state that really still hasn't made its mind up about what it thinks about private wealth. How does he operate in that environment? I want to just talk also about two things I've personally been involved in co-founding since we wrote the book, and one is called the Giving Tuesday campaign, which was really founded by a friend of mine called Henry Timms, who's written a very good book called New Power, which I would recommend to you if you haven't seen it. But essentially we launched it in 2013 as a hashtag, and it came out of a conversation around Thanksgiving, which was, why is Thanksgiving such a lovely holiday followed by this sort of orgy of shopping on Black Friday and Cyber Monday? Why don't we do something about getting back to the spirit of giving on Giving Tuesday and have an online campaign around that? And I think we were very lucky in that we coincided with lots of companies and charities having organised millennials to run their websites and had no idea what to do with them, so they were all very keen to be given a project. And as a result, they were very, very inventive in getting this out there. But now we never saw it as anything other than a US-orientated campaign. I hosted a meeting in Bellagio in this spring for the Giving Tuesday Global Group, and there are now 50 countries with a Giving Tuesday event. None of whom, very few of them have Thanksgiving, or I think they're all Black Friday. I think they have Cyber Monday somehow. But anyway, there are now 50 countries where they have a Giving Tuesday. It's basically about just celebrating giving, what you're most passionate about giving to, and the fact that there is such global traction for something like this, and that we think on the day, this last year raised several hundred million online above what you would have expected, without any real, and it's an entirely distributed model. It's just a platform. Every organisation goes, takes whatever the logo and other things and the press releases off there and customizes it for themselves, and it just has an amazing momentum. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that thinking about the global effects of the Giving Pledge, it's really interesting that until the Giving Pledge occurred, at least at the first part, during the first period of the Giving Pledge, there were no foreign, non-American donors. And there were some notable wealthy individuals, like Carlos Slim, for example, who was interviewed and said, why don't you give away more money to charity? He said, I don't want to give away any money to charity. My greatest impact is going to be creating jobs. 5 years later, after the Buffett Gates Pledge was started, he joined it. It also has produced the billionaire members. I mean, imagine the first notable giver ever from Scotland joined. The Scots are not as miserly as they're thought to be, obviously. But now you look around the world, you see members of the Giving Pledge from China, from India, from other countries in Latin America, from other countries in Europe. So the point is, I felt from the beginning that the Giving Pledge would have much greater effect abroad than it would in the United States. And I think that's still the case. I think there were not many new donors who were attracted to it because of the fact that it was there. But Brad Smith, the head of the Foundation Council, and now the chairman and CEO of this new organization called Candid, which is a combination of the Foundation Center and the website. He said, the idea of creating a club that rich people all over the world would like to join because of the people in the United States who are involved in it as leaders there, it spread. And the growth in the non-US members has been larger in the last 5 years than the growth among the US members in it. So in any event, I didn't want to interrupt you, but it was related to what you were saying.
Absolutely. So the other thing I got involved in was something called the Social Progress Imperative, which again came out of a conversation with a lot of philanthropists and social entrepreneurs in about 2011, and we were trying to come up. It became very clear that it was an international group, and that people were really frustrated that no one could really compare from one country to another what worked and what didn't work, and we just had this GDP obsession. Like countries with bigger GDP were better than those that had lower GDP. And so a number of philanthropies that Skoll Foundation, Ford, Rockefeller, Larry Page, various other, Nick Hanauer, over the years have funded creating an index. We worked with Michael Porter at Harvard Business School to do this, to actually try and create a proper map of how societies are doing in terms of actually delivering social progress to their people, because it seemed like one of the big problems that philanthropists and indeed governments have is that they didn't have good data on what was working and what wasn't, and certainly as they were looking around the world, it was very hard for them to see where the examples of real success were, in contrast to the business world, where there was a lot of data and a lot of evidence on what was going well and what wasn't. And so this social progress index, has been really funded entirely by philanthropy. And now, what we're discovering is that the US is actually going backwards on the measures that we have, and that's particularly driven by some of the violence and intolerance and rights areas of how you define it. But also we've now just broken it down into a state level measure, and you can see where the in terms of how measured out of 100, this is how the different states are. And I show this partly because it's philanthropists doing what I think one of the things that I've been most disappointed about in the 10 years since the book came out is how little philanthropists in general have been willing to invest in the ecosystem of measurement and impact that would allow you to really raise your game as a philanthropist and as a society in terms of delivering good to your people. So this was one attempt that we have going on to try and provide some of that data. But it's really, what we've discovered is it's really, really hard to raise money for this kind of work because philanthropists, there still seems to be a bias towards things that you can be photographed funding, like babies and schools and things like that.
What are the measures, just to make sure I'm understanding what I'm
On this, so what we have basically, it's 3 pillars of 4 components in each pillar. Basic needs, what we call foundations of well-being, and then rights and opportunities in the 3 columns. There's a website, socialprogress.org, but it's a mixture of very fundamental things like housing and shelter and health, basic health care, through to being able to marry who you want or not being attacked for political views and that kind of thing. Anyway, I wanted to, this broad point, that, and it's one of the points Joel made to me before we come back onto Soros, when we were first talking about philanthropy, was there's this thing called the philanthropist's curse, which is that when you become a philanthropist, you never eat a bad meal or tell a bad joke ever again, because you're surrounded by people that give you positive feedback about however bad you are as a philanthropist. You will never hear it from the people around you because they all want to apply to you for money. And so, I think one of the things that, and it's why Phil, back in the day, Phil Buchanan, was able to make this Lehman Brothers to the rescue jibe about the book, was that we have this chapter called Virtues Intermediaries. And the basic notion was that one of the things that makes capitalism work as well as it does, which is obviously not perfectly and was particularly bad the week before our book came out, is that there's a whole series of professionals in the middle whose job is to actually figure out what is working well and what isn't, and to get the money away from what isn't working well and to put it where it is going to succeed. And it seemed to me that was the thing that was missing from philanthropy, that everybody was basically defining their own yardstick of success, and there was no one in the system willing to give honest feedback, or very rare people in the system that were willing to give honest feedback. And if you ask me to say one thing that really hasn't happened, which I thought would happen over this 10-year period, it is that we just haven't seen really the maturing of a intermediary sector in the way that I would have liked to see it. We see consultants like Bridgespan who we've what's the new there's the Dalberg emerging as seriously large players who do provide very strong professional consulting support to philanthropies, but we haven't seen that real public debate about buy and sell, essentially, that you get in the financial markets around performance of philanthropists and performance of the organisations that they are giving money to. And it's very hard, therefore, to have real confidence that the money is being deployed as well as it should be. And very hard even for, you have to be incredibly self-disciplined and self-scrutinising as a philanthropist to really hold yourself to account on doing a good job as a philanthropist, because the whole system around you is almost designed to stop you doing that, because anyone will throw you a black tie dinner. They'll give you an award. They will tell you you're doing a great job, and here's 2 or 3 other ideas that you might want to fund as well. So it's a problem, and I think if we can't solve that problem, it's going to be very hard for philanthropists to argue back in many cases, particularly when they move into more nuanced areas like fighting inequality and building social capital up, that they're really doing a good job when the critics say they aren't. So I still think that is a huge challenge. We're starting to see some progress on the other area that I hoped would be a lot more advanced than it is, which is collaboration between philanthropists. And so one of the things that Rockefeller is partly involved in funding is something called co-impact, where a bunch of the very wealthy philanthropists have said they will form a kind of collective vehicle that will scale up proven non-profit models to reach much greater numbers of people. And then there's Blue Meridian here in the States, which is another very interesting example of that. And there are a few of these vehicles that are emerging. Rockefeller has also done a fund jointly with MacArthur Foundation, where MacArthur's put 30 million into this Rockefeller fund to help develop some impact investing, catalytic finance, to help encourage the mainstream capitalist financial markets to move into areas that they would be normally staying out of. So there are a few examples there, but again, I think it's the not invented here syndrome is terrible in philanthropy still. And the lack of care, I think, about exit strategies, which is another thing that people in the financial world think about all the time, is not very well thought about in philanthropy. So lots of organizations get given money that gets them started. They're just about to enter into their fast growth phase, and they hit what they call the valley of death, where suddenly the original funders have decided that they've proved their point and they're going to move on and do something else, and no one else wants to take over that role because they didn't invent it themselves. And so those issues are still, we write about them in the book, they're still problematic about philanthropy, and they, you know, we need to figure out how do we create an environment which really rewards philanthropists for doing those things collaboratively, and less about the size of the check and the size of the foundation, and more about the outcome. And so my hope is that what will come out of some of this critique that's going on at the moment is that we will have the philanthropic sector raise its game on these points. The trouble is the nature of certainly the Anand critique is so hostile to the very act of philanthropy that it's hard for there to be a constructive response to it, which is actually, what you really want is a book that says, okay, how do you raise your game as a group of philanthropists, rather than just you're all bad for even doing it in the first place. Now, I want to make 2 more points in finishing. I mean, George Soros, I think, is one of the most remarkable philanthropists. Whether you love him or hate him, he's made a huge difference. But it's very interesting to me what's happened to him, most notably in Hungary, where he was born, and where he founded the Central European University that's had to move out of the country. I mean, there are issues around anti-Semitism, clearly, but I think there's also, he is emblematic of a huge trend that is going on around the world at the moment, of the deliberate trying to shut down the global philanthropists and to close the space available to civil society. That I think we are all kind of sleepwalking into allowing to happen. It's a part of the general populist, hard man leadership fashion that's going on at the moment. But the first thing that Putin does is he starts getting foreign charities and foreign philanthropists to have to register as foreign agents in Russia and so forth. This is now happening in lots of places, and I think it's something we all need to be thinking about a lot harder. And then we have the issue of Jeffrey Epstein and the Sacklers. Again, in the book, this is rather a dense slide, but we have this statement near the end. What we're calling for, recognizing that the wealth was going to be a growing political issue in society, saying there ought to be a new social contract between the rich and everyone else. And we set out this thing called the Good Billionaire's Guide, which had three components. One was that you should make your money in an ethical fashion. The second was that you should pay a higher rate of taxes than everybody else that wasn't earning as much. And the third was that you should give away effectively a good part of your wealth. What's happening at the moment is quite interesting in that respect. If we go back to Sackler and Epstein, and I think the Sacklers are probably classic examples of, they would fail the Good Billionaire's Guide because they were obviously making their money in an unethical fashion by pushing these opioids out in a way that they knew was going to be deeply harmful. Epstein is more complicated because he appears not to have made his money. Well, we don't know how he made his money actually, but the reason he is unethical, he is a pariah, is obviously that he's a convicted sex offender and alleged sex trafficker who was clearly right at the heart of philanthropy, major philanthropic circles, right up until maybe a few months ago.
Including the British royal family.
British royal family, yeah, I'm not sure they're philanthropic particularly, but certainly, met with Gates in 2013. I think that a lot of, it makes you it makes you question the judgment of the philanthropists when they seem to be allowing those sort of personal relationships to go on, I think that now every organisation that receives money from philanthropists and every philanthropist that is working with other philanthropists really needs to be much more skeptical about, much more scrutinising of the people they are dealing with, because you are going to see every institution's endowment looked at and the donor base looked at, and if you have people who've been giving you money that don't meet maybe the Caesar's wife test or whatever, you're going to find yourself in a mess. You're going to be a newspaper story. You're going to have to give money back. Now, what effect this has on philanthropy is sort of going to be interesting to see, because in some ways it could be a spur to see everyone raise their game, be much more focused on people who are good people working together. On the other hand, I generally believe it's better to be working with people that you share values with and so forth. You're more likely to be successful in doing what you're trying to do. On the other hand, I think one of the roles that philanthropy has played throughout the ages has been a way for society to kind of get some payback from its worst members and get some of the money back in a way that gives. When there's been a big disruption, someone makes a lot of money, maybe there's a lot of things going on that you don't quite like the look of and the smell of, but you can kind of normalise people again back into society through them giving away a lot of money. That has been a historic role of philanthropy. Maybe that moment is past, or we'll have to create new entities that, or new ways of getting that money back into circulation and being put to good use.
And when you do the sequel to Philanthrocapitalism, we'll have you come back again.
Thank you.
And talk about some of the things that
Maybe
happened.
I'll come back and write it here again.
Well, that's a good idea too. Let me know when you're ready. Let me just mention other forthcoming seminars. On the 25th of September, Rip Rapson, who's been here before, president of the Kresge Foundation, will be coming back to give us a report on what's happened in Detroit since the big bargain, the grand bargain. On October the 30th, Rebecca Rimmel, president of the Pew Charitable Trust, will be coming. She's just announced that she is stepping down from the running of the foundation. So this will be her last visit here as president, though she'll come back again afterward, I hope. And on November 13th, Michael Marsicano, who is the president of the Foundation for the Carolinas in Charlotte, which is the largest community foundation in North or South Carolina will be speaking. And on December the 4th, Mario Marino, the chairman of the Marino Institute and co-founder of Venture Philanthropy Partners, is going to come. So you'll get notices about all of them. And if you're not on our mailing list, you need to let us know and we'll put you on the mailing list. So I thank you all for coming. And I thank Matthew especially for flying down here and spending a day with us. And we hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
Thanks.